Continuing our series on what the Bible has to say about reality, the rules and structures and knowledge that guide everything about our life. And we've covered, it's hard to believe, but this is actually lesson 53 in this series. 53, so we've been doing this for over a year now. And I hope it's been a blessing to you. The purpose of this series was to kind of talk about how in our world today, there are many who sort of deny that certain things exist, or they deny whether or not something is right. And so like we've looked at things like faith, how faith is not just for church, that faith exists in every area of life. Whether you are in church or not, faith exists. We've covered things like work, and that work is part of our reality. It's not, it's unavoidable, and but now we live in a world where people say work is a bad thing, and what does the Bible have to say about that? And so we've been talking about this idea of self-interest now, and how self-interest is part of our reality. And last week, as we were kind of going through that, we concluded our section on understanding another by really taking a deep dive at the main characters involved in the conflict between Paul and Barnabas. And we focused on how if we humbly accept our own sin nature, that first puts us into a position to see Paul and Barnabas as real men and not hold them to standards of perfection that we could never attain ourselves. We looked at how the Bible, what the Bible tells us about their personalities, how Paul was a man accustomed to leadership and speaking. He was full of grit and determination, and likely he was gifted with the spiritual gifts of prophecy and teaching. We discussed how this often brings about behavior where a person like that tends to see people working with him more as levers to be pulled to get the job done, and less as people to be built up and handled with care. That people like Paul could sometimes struggle with being understanding of the faults and failures of others, because Paul was what we would call an A-type person. You know, he was very driven and whatnot. Now, we did look at other places, specifically like in Acts 20, and we saw how it didn't mean that Paul didn't love people and that people didn't love him. We saw how his friends and followers wept as he returned to Jerusalem and then to Rome, and they knew he would never return to them from that journey, and how they fell on him and they hugged him and kissed him. And Paul loved people and people loved him, but humbly accepting our own sin nature allows us to see that perhaps at times Paul might have been difficult to get along with, as a highly successful and highly motivated, as people like that sometimes can be difficult to get along with. But we looked at Barnabas, and how Barnabas is called the son of consolation, and that he was likely gifted with the spiritual gifts of exhortation and forgiveness. And we read in Acts how Ananias was given the vision to believe Paul's conversion, but not Barnabas. And yet it was Barnabas who spoke up and encouraged the other disciples to forgive Paul and put faith in his conversion when they were afraid of him and they kept their distance. We saw how Barnabas was a man prone to forgive and lift up people in their mistakes. And we learned that it wasn't impossible, that he was trying to do the very same thing with John Mark. That was the kind of man Barnabas was. He was the sort of man who wanted to give a second chance to people. And we talked about how, but it's very possible, Paul felt like it just wasn't the right time for John Mark yet. But Barnabas felt like it was. And you can see how, when we humbly accept our sin nature, we can see how these two people's personalities and their spiritual gifts might bring them into natural conflict. And we did this exercise to show that while the exercise does not change the outcome, it doesn't change the fact that Barnabas walks off the pages of Scripture, that Paul goes on to be this very successful missionary. It doesn't change that, but it helps us to see both people involved in the conflict and learn a little more of maybe what might have gone on, and helps us to see beyond the outcome and beyond our innate human desire for one side to be right and the other side to be wrong. And remember, the entire motivation to this was this idea that we as human beings, we kind of shy away from that mental discomfort that comes from caring about somebody who does something we think is wrong. Then what our mind seeks to do out of laziness is just say, well, then they're bad people. And the Bible encourages us to work beyond that, to push ourselves maturely to see. And we used, 2 weeks ago, we used abortion as our example of how it doesn't make abortion right for someone that we love to have done that. But we can, if we put some effort in, understand how they might have come to that conclusion, to make that choice, and love them anyway, right? And that's the big difference. That is what this exercise is all about. And so today we're going to pick back up with this idea of self-interest, because I think it's one that we don't often understand, and I think we kind of confuse self-interest and selfishness too much, and they are not actually the same thing, and I want to talk about that today. A few months back, I listened to a book called Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, or people pronounce her name Ayn Rand, and I highly recommend it to everybody. I will say though, it is not entry level anything. It is a very long book, and it was definitely written in a day and age when people read more. Meaning, like, they didn't expect to crack a book open and immediately be in, like, oh, okay, I start right in the middle of everything that's fun and awesome, and there's never a wasted word, everything's cut out. I mean, it can be grueling, to get through some books like this, right? As an example of this, I often say, like, if you've ever actually read The Lord of the Rings, not just watched the movie, you'll find out that the book doesn't actually start until page 90. Lord of the Rings would never be published today. Ever. It could never be published, because nobody wants to start on page 90 with the story, right? So I say all that to say, Atlas Shrugged isn't an easy book, but it is pretty profound if you take the time. But there's a character introduced in the book, and this guy's name is James Taggart. Not to be confused with our own James McTaggart, but James Taggart. James Taggart in the book is the CEO of this massive train company. He's popular, he's well-liked, he's powerful, and he's rich. But he's also one of the most nefarious and shocking villains that I've ever read. James is a political sort of guy. He sits on some powerful councils, and he's got powerful friends, and he helps to sort of facilitate some special interest groups. And he's the sort of man who's convinced himself that he is very good. He is very, very good. And he is below and beneath all of the stuff that sort of plagues our world today. And when he makes decisions, it's for the good of everybody. There's no self-interest involved, and so on and so forth. And he is the altruistic person, and he believes that everything he does is for the good of someone else. And at one point in the story, while he's rich and powerful, he meets a lonely, plain-faced girl who's working at a five-and-dime store. And she's enamored with him because he's rich and powerful, and he's on the cover of the best magazines in town. Eventually he marries her, but he convinces himself and then her that he did so out of the goodness of his own heart. That he marries this plain-faced girl out of the goodness of his own heart. And there are several passages in the book that talk about this, and it'll make sense why I'm mentioning this in today's lesson, but like at some point, one of the characters will say something along the lines of, well, love isn't really love if you love a beautiful person. Because real love, only true love, is to love someone who's ugly and to help them out of a bad situation. That's true love. So if physically speaking, you're a 7, true love is to marry somebody way far down on the looks scale than you, to marry a 2 or a 3. That's true love. Because if you marry another 7, then that's not really love, right? You're just doing for them what they've earned, essentially, is this thought. And so he did, after all, in his own mind, he lifted her out of this miserable existence working at the five-and-dime store. But one of the things you find out as the character unfolds is that this girl that he married from the five-and-dime store, she came from a pretty bad home life. And her home life was that her mom was sort of like, it doesn't really say like she was addicted to drugs, but that's kind of the implication. And basically that she expected her daughter to go out and work to come home to bring money. And then eventually the daughter got tired of it and struck out on her own. And so she works at the five-and-dime store. And she doesn't really have much in the way of a formal education, but her managers like her, and she's really hardworking, and she does a good job, right? And the idea is that she is pretty respectable in her own way, right? Doesn't have everything going for her, but she does do a pretty good job in the world that she's in. And I don't want to spoil the story for people who might go on, but I think that many people today think of themselves like this. And I think this honestly even happens in Christian circles as well. I mean, surely I'm not the only person who's ever encountered somebody who talks about themselves like they're a walking martyr, that everything they do is for somebody else's good. Is that true? And is that healthy? And I think sometimes Christians do truly think this way. They think that God has called us to live lives that are just for everybody else's benefit and not for our own. I mean, I don't want to ask for a show of hands, but how many of you in here know of a mother who behaves like this? Now, I say this not to pick on women, but actually because I think by and large, when a woman has a child, it's more in her nature to give constantly to a child. And the reality is it's in the child's nature to take constantly from a mother.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why God put a man involved in it, is to say, hey, babe, I love you. You've given enough. Now the child is just acting like a jerk. Put the baby to bed, or, tell the teenager to get off their phone, or I'm going to take their car keys, or, stop paying their insurance, or whatever the case might be, right? This is one of the reasons, though, why I started with this section in this series, like sort of as our theme verses in Matthew 23, verses 1 through 7. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and said to his disciples, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men, for they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. You see, James Taggart was like this in the story. He was the sort of person who walked around bragging about the fact that he had married this plain-faced girl, and he brought her out of this thing. And he, as the story unfolds, what you find is that he believed she owed him something for what he had done for her. And eventually we learn, as James learns in the story, that his self-interest, which he's denied having for so long, is there, and we learn just how dark and nefarious it is. And so today I want to talk about this idea that self-interest is unavoidable and it is not evil. Self-interest is unavoidable and it is not evil. Now, we've talked about this and sort of been laying the foundation for this message over the past several months. We talked about it especially when we talked about things like work and money. Because, we in church, right? Surely none of us have ever seen somebody else financially in church more successful than us and thought, well, they don't deserve that, right? I mean, surely none of us have ever looked down on someone else for having a little bit more than we have. No. Now, I want to be clear, self-interest that I'm talking about here is not selfishness. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. I think people shy away from this because it's difficult to tread this line. It really is. That's why I say this is not entry-level Christianity, if you will. But you must understand that in order for you to do anything in life, there must be some self-interest in it. There must be. And we're going to see how even God respects this and how he handles us. But self-interest is not selfishness. Self-interest is not selfishness. Look at chapter 3, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves. So here he says men shall be lovers of their own selves, and he's going to explain what that means. Behavior like this. Covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Verse number 5, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. You see that last part, especially having the form of godliness, this is how all of humanity operates. Humanity doesn't always seek to have a form of what we would call godliness. What they do is they seek to redefine what that form of godliness is. You see that today, right? I mean, we're dealing with situations that I think most people would recognize is just about as significant as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
We're dealing with that right now in this world, in our world. People don't understand what this conflict in Russia and Ukraine, what could really happen here.
Right.
Do you realize that for the last, Well, since the very end of World War II, there has been one guiding principle in U.S. foreign policy that can never be broken. And do you know what that one guiding principle is? Never go into direct conflict with Russia. Ever. That has been our piece. And so here we are in a position where we must either sit back and allow Russia to do what Russia's doing. Did you know that just recently Putin ordered first, before he did the draft, he ordered that now men who surrender to the forces of Ukraine get 10 years in prison? I mean, think about that. So he does that first, then he orders the draft. Now then, you're going to be drafted, you're going to be forced to fight, and if you surrender, now, the only stipulation is you must figure out a way to get yourself out of a Ukrainian prison if you're captured. Then you don't have to serve 10 years in prison. But if the Russian army frees you from Ukrainian captivity, you see how sick this is? Yeah. This is the kind of sickness we're faced with. Yeah. But you know what is our form of godliness in this country right now? Trans issues.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
That's what's super important in our world right now.
Yeah. Sure.
Trans issues. You see how our world defines a form of godliness that they want to follow?
Right.
Isn't it interesting that it's not things like don't be a liar, don't be a cheat, don't be a thief? No, it's none of that stuff. It's trans issues. Now you go to IKEA and people have these are my pronouns.
Yeah.
Right? Because our world has defined a form of godliness that they want, which denies the power of real godliness. So we're not talking about selfishness here, and I want to make that clear. Because selfishness, and we don't have time to break into this, but I will look at one verse. Go to Proverbs chapter 11. If you want to understand the difference between selfishness and self-interest. Now, we can't go into a deep study on this, but we'll just cover it briefly. The difference between selfishness and self-interest is this. In self-interest, I'm simply saying, in order for me to do this thing, there must be something in it for me. Selfishness, though, says, what is in it for me comes at your expense. And that's a big difference. Okay? So one of the examples, I was talking with some friends from work, and I do try to avoid political conversations, but this one got away from me. But we were talking, and I was talking about how I used to be a bus captain, years ago, and I would pick up these kids, and we did it over in the Knob area and stuff like that. And I remember going to like one kid's house, and it would be the middle of winter, and the door would be open, just the screen door there, and I could walk up and see the dad passed out on the couch. And I'd have to walk and step over all these beer bottles and everything else, right? And then the kid would come out in t-shirts and shorts in the middle of the winter with snow. I'd take my coat off and I'd wrap them up and then pick them up and take them on the bus and stuff, That's selfishness. You see, for the dad to do what he does at the expense of his children, that's selfishness. That's not self-interest.
That's right.
That's different. You see? Yes. So what we're talking about here is not selfishness. But look at Proverbs chapter 11, verse 1. A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. This isn't talking about having your life out of balance. This is actually talking about scales. You go to do business. Somebody comes up to you and says, I want to buy a pound of this, and I'm going to pay this. And you put something on the thing that's not a pound. You've sold them 3/4 of a pound because you used something that looks like a pound for your scale, but is not really. You charged them for a pound, but you only gave them 3/4 of a pound. That's a false weight. That is selfishness. That's not self-interest. But self-interest, like we've talked about with work and such, is two people coming together saying, you have something I want, I have something to offer in exchange. There is self-interest for both parties there. You see? I've had this conversation a lot recently with my oldest daughter, who's in college now, and she asked me a brilliant question the other day. Dad, why doesn't the Bible just say outright that slavery is bad? That's a fantastic question. Why not? Do you ever realize that the Bible doesn't get into many practical areas in terms of setting rules with people? Do you know why? Because there would never be a good place to stop. There would never be a good place to stop. And this is one of the places where humanity goes wrong. We think that if we write enough laws, someday we'll make good people. And we can. But you recognize that if you follow biblical principles, then you will be repulsed by the idea of slavery. So the Bible doesn't get into it because eventually then, okay, slavery is just the beginning, isn't it? Because then it's, okay, so then what's a fair wage? Why doesn't the Bible tell us what a fair wage is? And should people get weekends off? What about maternity leave? And, this and that and so on and so forth. What should minimum wage be? There will never be enough laws to make good people.
That's right.
Amen.
But self-interest is understanding that, listen, if you come to the table and I come to the table and we strike a deal that we both agree on, and we're both honest and we both get something out of it, then we're good.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, you realize that means that maybe I go somewhere and I buy something and I find out a week later I could have bought it cheaper someplace else. But the person didn't lie to me. He did nothing nefarious.
Right.
There was nothing wrong in that.
Right.
Right? We've talked about that. So self-interest is not selfishness, but it is unavoidable in our life. And I point this out because we must understand that in all areas of our lives, there must be something in it for us. There must be. There must be. Did you realize that in this life, God works with that for us too? Go to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Go back to 2 Timothy chapter 2. A lot of people would say that our faith is foolish. I know many people, many popular people like Joe Rogan, Ricky Gervais, and others talk about the fact that it's silly to believe in God. It's silly to believe in Christ. They equate our beliefs with things like Scientology or the Church of Latter-day Saints or other things like that, right? And so, but it is a fair question. Humanly speaking, it's a fair question. But it boils down to this. Is our faith a ridiculous faith? Is our faith built upon something that is not reasonable? I would argue it's not.
No.
Our faith isn't built on this idea that there was a spaceship that came down and these aliens that we've never seen that started all this stuff, right? And, if we just do this and drink enough Kool-Aid, someday we'll all get to... It's not like that at all.
Right.
In fact, our faith is fairly reasonable to say that if there's a God, and that God created this earth, then he gets to be in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where our faith really begins.
Yeah.
That's right.
But see, God does not ask us to have an unrealistic perspective of our faith on this earth. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2. We could literally go through just about every single verse in the Bible and find how God says, do this, and here's something good that happens.
Yeah.
Here, do this, here's something good that happens. Let's just look at a couple. 2 Timothy chapter 2, we're not going to read this whole chapter, but go to verse number 6. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse number 6. The husbandman that laboreth must first be partaker of the fruits. Oh, so wait. So I shouldn't just work for free? No, I shouldn't, right? I mean, Bob shouldn't sell insurance for free. If I'm working with Bob on my insurance, I should expect Bob to make some money. Why? Because Bob has to provide for his family just like I got to provide for mine.
Yep.
That's right.
Right? This is one of the reasons why, generally speaking, I have a very firm no friends in business policy. I don't do friends in business on purpose for this reason, because it can get messy, People can tend to think, well, I'm also your friend, so you should pay me more, or I should pay you less because you're my friend, right? And all that. Look at verse number 11. It is a faithful saying, for if we be dead with him, what? We shall also live with him. Okay? Verse number 12. If we suffer, what? We shall also reign with him. If we deny him, what? He will deny us. There, it's just a negative. So if I don't deny him, he doesn't deny me. That's the benefit that I get. You see how each one of these, this is just one chapter. But shun profane and vain babblings. Verse 16. Why? For they will increase to more ungodliness. Verse number 21. If a man therefore purge himself from these, what? He shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. So if I do these things, then I become a more pure vessel, more able to be used by God. That's what I want. Verse 23. But foolish and unlearned questions avoid. Why? Knowing that they do gender strifes. not gender as in male and female, but rather give birth to strifes. So you see here, he's just saying, if you avoid this stuff, you'll have less conflict in your life. Who doesn't want less conflict in your life? God doesn't ask us to do things simply because there's some grand eternal benefit out there that we may or may not actually see, right? He says, no. Do these things now. There's a lot of benefit in it for you right now. Go to Luke chapter 10, verse 7. Luke chapter 10, verse 7. Luke chapter 10, verse 7. We won't read this whole passage, but in the same house remain, eating and drinking such as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house. What is he saying there? He's saying, you're going to go places and people are going to try to take care of you. Let them, because you're worthy of your hire. Right? Oh man, isn't that contradictory to often what we hear preached and taught as gospel, right? Oh, you should feel guilty about everything that you get in this world. Why? Right? If what you have, you got by hard work, determination, living the way God says, and with an upfront and honest character, what do you have to be ashamed of? Right? God does not tell us to be people of wisdom simply for the sake of building eternal riches in heaven. Go to Proverbs chapter 8. We're going to have to kind of quickly go through some of these verses. Proverbs chapter 8. Verse number 10, receive my instruction and not silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. So this is God talking about wisdom. He says, for wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. Skip over to verse number 18, though. What's it say? Riches and honor are with me. Wisdom is speaking. So why have wisdom? Because you get paid. Oh man, you can't say that in church. Yeah, I can. I'm not talking that God's going to make you, the head of Tesla and you're going to be worth billions of dollars. That's what I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Bible verse that says, I've been old, or I've been young and now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor begging bread. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. That's the level that God has for us. Provision, peace, and happiness. That's the level. And that's what comes with wisdom. Go back one chapter to Proverbs chapter 7, verse 25. Proverbs chapter 7, verse 25. This is talking about self-control and understanding the virtue of marriage. Lust not after her beauty in thine heart, neither let her take thee with her eyelids. For by means of a whorish woman a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for precious life. What's the benefit in avoiding the strange woman? That I don't become brought low to a piece of bread. I don't want that. All right? Proverbs chapter 6, verse 9. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. Why? So thy poverty shall come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. If you're lazy, you tend to also be poor. Don't be lazy. Don't be poor. Right? Again, God says these are things of wisdom, but they're not about building up eternal riches in heaven only. They're about having a good life here too. God does not ask things from you that only have eternal relevance. Now I'm going to stop there. I have loads. This is just from glancing through Proverbs, but Proverbs 4, 20 through 23, Proverbs 10, 1 and 4, Proverbs 12, 11, Proverbs 13, 3, Proverbs 13, 24. Loads of verses. You could literally go through just about every single verse and chapter in Proverbs and understand God doesn't say live a certain way just because I told you to. God literally says it's good for you to do it.
Right. Yeah.
It's good for you to do it. But I mentioned this about women often struggling with this. So what about the virtuous woman? You might say, well, wait a minute. What about the virtuous woman? Because the virtuous woman talks about all that stuff that she does for other people. And it's true. Go to Proverbs 31. Yeah. Proverbs 31. Let's see here. So we'll try to go through this quickly. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. Let's see here. I'm going to just try to get to the verses that talk about her doing things for people. Verse 13, she seeketh wool and flax, worketh willingly with her hands. Verse 15, she riseth also while it is yet night, giveth meat to her household and a portion to her maidens. She considereth the field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planted the vineyard. Verse number 20, she stretcheth out her hand to the poor. Yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She's not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates. Verse 25, strength and honor her clothing. She may rejoice in the time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. If we stopped right there, we would say, man, the virtuous woman, she just wakes up every day and kills it to do for other people. And she does it for nothing in return. The virtuous woman is just the gold standard of women. If we stopped there. But what's verse 28 say? Her children arise up and what? Call her blessed. There is benefit in being a woman of virtue. People see that and respect that. You want a good relationship with your children, ladies? Be a virtuous woman. Her husband also, and what? He praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall what? Be praised. And what's verse 31 say? Now, we never read this verse when we talk about the virtuous woman. Because, and I'll say this honestly, I do think oftentimes it's because men like the idea of the virtuous woman up to a certain point. Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't? Oh yeah, she wakes up every day, she makes my laundry, she does my laundry, she makes my lunch, she takes care of me, she takes care of my kids. This is amazing. What's verse 31 say? Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Oh, well, the first part, I mean, that conflicts with this idea that we have of virtuous women, doesn't it? That they should actually get what is coming to them in a good way, not like in a serial killer way, right? But the second part conflicts oftentimes with how men see their wives. Because oftentimes men see their wives as just the verse in verse 23. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land, in the sense that, so she should make my reputation better. But she can't shine in a way that threatens my stuff, right? Like, I mean, people couldn't go to her for advice and not me. But the Bible says, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Even the virtuous woman, it's not all about everybody else. It comes back for her. So, the point. Self-interest is not a bad thing. You cannot exist without self-interest. You cannot. Even your salvation isn't based upon building treasures in heaven only. Right? That's why the Bible tells us that we have a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Here on this earth, in this life, there is benefit to being saved. Yeah. It's not simply about eternity. It's about this life right now too. We do not have an unreasonable faith. And our faith here is not just about the eternal. So, the point of all this is, when you find yourself thinking that you're doing for everybody else and not for yourself, understand there can be self-interest involved in that. And that self-interest is also way worse than understanding that there must be something in it for you. Because if you're the type of person who says, well, I just do for them, and I just do for them, and I just do for them, you're feeding something very bad in yourself. Don't do that. Don't do that. The moment you see that behavior, stop and say to yourself, no, that's not the self-interest I need. So if I'm unhappy in my marriage because my needs aren't met, then I need to deal with that. That's the self-interest I should be addressing. Sitting down with my spouse and saying, there are problems in our relationship, and this is not working for me. It doesn't mean you're talking about quitting the relationship. It means actually saying, I want to remain married, therefore this thing should be fixed. Right? Not, oh yeah, my husband, he's an idiot. He does whatever he wants and so on and so forth, and I just do the best that I can to get by. No. that won't last in the long run. And it's way more unhealthy than just having the conflict and saying, we need to address this. Your relationships, your friendships, if you're finding yourself in a position where you're just giving and sacrificing to your kids, then something's probably wrong that you should address. It's the same for your ministry, your job, your hobbies, your passions, your goals. There's got to be something in it for you. And that doesn't make it bad. And so I hope as we kind of conclude this section on self-interest, we recognize when you see people out there that talk about the fact that they're so good, they've sort of beaten this self-interest thing, understand that is the devil talking. That is not God talking. Because God does not even speak to you that way. God, who is the author of our very existence, doesn't ask us to do things that aren't for our benefit here on this earth. So remember that. Father, we thank you for this day and all the many blessings you've given us. I pray that you be with us this hour, that if there's any here that don't know you,